Welcome to the Plant Trainers Podcast, where we're helping people improve their quality of life through nutrition and fitness. And now, your hosts, nutrition and wellness coaches, international speakers, Adam and Shoshana Chaim.
Hey, I'm Adam Chaim.
And I'm Shoshana Chaim, and we are
Propelled by Plants. Today we bring to you episode 266, Effects of Food with the creator of the Glycemic Index, Dr. David Jenkins.
In today's episode of the Plant Trainers Podcast, we talk to Dr. David Jenkins, the man behind the Glycemic Index. His name is not that famous, but his research really is. But we do hear Dr. Jenkins' name being spoken more and more with his amazing work and speaking engagements in the vegan and diabetes community. Dr. Jenkins starts his talk with us today, or his interview with us today, by reminiscing about growing up in Europe and spending some time on his aunt's property and his excitement and love for all things Christmas. But it ends up being the catalyst for him giving up meat and instilling worry and fear for his mom about his overall health. But little did she know that he would grow up to create the ever-popular Glycemic Index and reside here in Toronto, Canada. Dr. Jenkins explains how the glycemic index and the bread index works, how fiber is the answer, and what you need to know about diabetes, and we talk a whole lot about poop. His opinion of oil and nuts is quite interesting as well, and you definitely want to hear about his opinion on soy products, especially for women with breast cancer. So get your friends and family together, pop in some organic popcorn and have a listen to this all together. Share it with them with a personal message as well if you're going to be emailing it to them. And don't forget to tag us at Plant Trainers on Instagram or Facebook if you do pop that popcorn.
Dr. Jenkins was educated at Oxford University and is a university professor and Cantor Research Chair in the Departments of Nutritional Sciences and Medicines. He's a staff physician in the Division of Endocrinology and Metabolism, the director of the Clinical Nutrition and Risk Factor Modification Center, and a scientist in the Li Ka-shing Knowledge Institute of St. Michael's Hospital. He's a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians in London and of the Royal College of Physicians of Canada. Dr. Jenkins has been a part of so many different committees, such as nutritional guidelines, diabetes, agriculture research, and creating healthier menu ingredients for various grocery chains. He's most famous for his team being the first to define and explore the concept of the glycemic index of foods and demonstrate the breadth of metabolic effects of viscous soluble fiber, including blood glucose and cholesterol lowering. No one can argue the fact that this man is smart. He's a leader in nutrition and a hardcore vegan.
Podcasting is like the street performing of radio. Street performers make up their acts, plan, prepare, and get all dressed up. Podcasters seduce guests into coming onto the show, prepare the show, and get the best recording gadgets. Street performers lure their audience in with a great opening act. Podcasters are constantly finding unique ways to let others know what's going on. Street performers have foot traffic to lure in, and podcasters have to work hard to get themselves out there. Street performers come back day after day because they love the way that people look when they laugh and are entertained. Podcasters come back week after week because they're passionate about their message and are humbled by how many people they help. Every now and again, you come across a performance that excites you, that you enjoy, that you can relate to, and then you throw a couple of bucks in the pot. Well, that pot for podcasters is called Patreon. It's a unique way that listeners can show their appreciation and help cover some of the hosting costs and hours of hard work that it takes to put shows out like this. So if you're feeling like this show lights you up, helps you, informs you, or maybe entertains you, we would be grateful for your donation at patreon.com/planttrainers. Even $1 helps us cover costs and ramp up our game. Thank you to those who already contribute and to those who will.
And now for a moment of gratitude.
I'm grateful for living in Ontario and taking our family trips down to the Adirondacks every year because it offers so many opportunities for hiking, being out in nature, seeing different plants, different insects, and just getting back to our roots of being man foraging through the forest. So I'm grateful for that.
I'm grateful for that too. Just being outside and enjoying the fresh air and getting out to be able to walk with the family and hike and travel a little bit is such a great time to spend together. And I'm just grateful for that opportunity.
Dr. Jenkins, thank you so much for joining us on the Plant Trainers Podcast today.
Well, I'm very pleased to be with you.
We're grateful that you're with us, and we were wondering if you had a moment of gratitude that you would share with us and our listeners.
Well, I'd like to just say that I'm so very grateful for my family and my friends.
That's beautiful. We talk about family and friends all the time and how when they help raise our vibrations and help us make us feel better, that we're able to bring more into the world as well. Is that kind of how you feel?
I think that's very true. I think, in fact, they're responsible for a lot of the good things one does bring into the world.
Well, I'm grateful for my trip. And normally Adam and I talk about our moments of gratitude before we begin the show. But I'm definitely grateful for my trip down to Ottawa that I had 2 weeks ago with my little daughter, where we were able to hear you speak at the Nation Rising event on Parliament Hill. And I didn't get a chance to come say hello to you because I was with my daughter and she kind of had enough by the end. But it was so wonderful to hear you speak in person and to see you up there.
Well, I hope your daughter didn't suffer too much from the extreme heat.
No, she was actually great in the heat. We had those big billboards, so we kind of hid under them a little bit, and I kept her very well hydrated, and she was able to get a lot of nice insight from the speakers, whatever it is that's sunk in. But she did very well.
Well, she's obviously highly intelligent because she's been eating the right food.
Absolutely, you know it. You know it. So
Right, step back.
she's been vegan or plant-based for probably about 4 years and vegetarian for a year before that. So she's been doing very well. But her change, there was nothing that prompted her change other than her parents.
Other than us.
Yeah, other than her parents said, it's time, we're going there. But I understand that you have a very interesting story of how you first became vegetarian.
Well, yes, that was when I was young. I was always interested in animals, but I used to hunt and I used to shoot. And I often wondered why I did it, but I nevertheless, because when we wounded animals, we took them home and tried to nurse them back to health, because my father was a surgeon, and so this was all very relevant to our medical history. But at one stage, I acquired at a church fete a bantam hen, a bantam cockerel, in fact, who was white and very pleased with himself. I won it by, I think, throwing a wooden ball at a coconut and not knocking it off its stand. And for the prize, I got this bantam cockerel, this rooster. And I thought that he'd better have a mate. So I managed to acquire a mate for him. They're only very small. They're not the size of regular fowl. They're quite small. They're sort of diminutive. They're sort of the pygmy version. And I was quite proud of them. And within time, they not only laid eggs, but they laid fertilized eggs. And I got a little hatch of bantam babies that followed the mother and father around on my aunt's grounds. My aunt had a large house with a large grounds around it where one could have pets, as it were. And I was very pleased with these. I was about 11 at the time, or perhaps 10. And then on the Christmas of when I was about 11, we had a hamper at Christmas time from my aunt. We lived many miles away from where she did. And she would always send us Christmas hampers with things that came from the countryside. Usually turkeys and sausages and meat cuts and also vegetables. So it was usually a big hamper, and much looked forward to at Christmas time. And what I noticed that Christmas was 2 bodies of small birds, and it suddenly dawned on me that were these my 2 bantam fowl that were my pets. And I realized fairly quickly that that's just what it must be, because they were much smaller than the turkey. They were much smaller than the other chickens and things that they'd put in this hamper. So I realized this is what they were. This is why they were the 2 small birds there.
So your pets were prepared as food?
Absolutely. And I saw it in the hamper, plucked, ready to be stuffed, ready to go into the oven. And I have to say that had a very necessary salutary effect on me. And as you can imagine, I was not a particularly happy camper that Christmas, nor did I feel like indulging in the usual Christmas fare.
So how did your parents react to that when you said, I'm not eating this?
Well, my mother thought, well, this is fine. Of course you don't want to eat this. And so did my father. But they weren't. My mother was not really prepared for the fact that it would cause a long-term change in my outlook. I then went vegetarian over the next few days. And my mother didn't mind me doing that as a sort of a mark of despair over what had happened. It was almost like sort of the funeral rites that I should not be eating meat for the next 7 days. But when the 7 days was over and I was still not eating meat, then she was a little worried. And I think she really didn't want me to go vegetarian because she thought that I'd fall apart. My father, fortunately, being a physician, said, no, the boy will be fine as long as he eats a balanced diet. So my father, as it were, came to my defense on this one through science. And my mother then worried immensely for the next 2 or 3 years, or 3 or 4 years even, as to how I would get a balanced diet and what nutrient I should take. So it was a sort of a stress for her. It was an obvious choice that my father could see I'd made. The fact that two of them came together was very supportive.
That's wonderful. And I guess that hindsight is 2020. And if your mother would have realized then that she was raising a vegetarian son who still had the brains to create the glycemic index, that she would have known that everything was going to be okay.
Well, I think she always had concerns about the way I was thinking. But I have to say that in later life, she became a vegan. Mm-hmm. It was good for her cholesterol level, and it was good for her heart disease risk.
I think it's very interesting that your story goes to a pet that you had, and that's what changed you as far as how you are going to be eating for the rest of your life. And if more people were able to make that connection between their pets and the food that they're eating, I think that would change a lot of the ways that people are consuming food these days.
Well, I think that's true. And I think I know quite a number of people for whom that has actually been true. I mean, they may have a dog, or they may be very fond of their dog, and then they wonder as to how different their dog is from other farmyard animals.
Yes, we interviewed Dr. Melanie Joy just a couple of weeks ago where we talked about some similarities there as well, and why it is that, we'll eat cows and pigs, but we won't eat our cats and dogs, right?
Well, that's true. And my parents also were interesting because they had some Swedish friends who were very wealthy, but they had 2 pets and they were pigs. Ah. And they regarded them as much more intelligent than the dogs they'd had previously.
That's what we hear about pigs, for sure. So let's fast forward a little bit, and why don't you talk to us? We're really interested to hear about what was really the basis behind creating the glycemic index. Where was that need, and what did it then come to accomplish, really?
Well, I'm not quite sure what it's accomplished. It has become, I think, accepted in some circles and not in others. But I think the original impetus for that came from the dietary fiber story, because Dennis Burkitt and Hugh Trowell, when they were in Uganda in Africa, they noticed that people were on what later became termed very high, unrefined, high-fiber carbohydrate diets. And they never seemed to get a lot of the diseases that we get in the West, such as diabetes, heart disease, colon cancer, ulcerative colitis, and many other diseases. So they came to the conclusion that it was probably the eating habits of, say, the Ugandans that determined their later health and ill health. And it seemed that one of the things that Dennis Burkitt noticed was the size of the feces produced by people in Uganda. In other words, people had no trouble going behind the screen, passing a urine sample, but also passing a fecal sample if requested. So this would not be typical in Western nations. And so they
poop on demand.
Yeah, absolutely. So so they came to the conclusion of actually photographing fecal outputs that were seen in Uganda, comparing them with Western fecal outputs, and noting the very big difference in size and morphology. One was like a cowpat and rose to a sort of a peak at the center, but it was round and relatively soft, and the other was sort of typically long and often with striations on it and relatively hard, and people would sometimes strain very hard to push these things out. So they came to the conclusion that these were related in many ways to not only physical concerns, but also metabolic concerns because of the rate at which one might be absorbing nutrients when one had a high fiber diet, and the slower rate with a high fiber diet, and the faster rate when you had a low fiber diet, because there was nothing to impede the rate of uptake by the mucosal cells of nutrients in the intestine. And so the concept of the unstirred water layer then became well known, and people were thinking how fiber might increase the viscosity of the intestinal contents and also the thickness of the unstirred water layer, all of which would be a barrier to nutrient absorption. So your glucose would be absorbed more slowly, and your insulin response would have to be less vigorous. You'd have amino acid influx, which was more measured and slower and over a longer period of time. So the metabolic perturbations would be much less on a higher fiber diet, where absorption of the nutrients from your gut was slower. And that was the theory. And so we thought, well, that's really talking about things that are not in the diet that are absorbed, but the things in the diet that aren't absorbed. And if that's so for fiber, what about fat, protein, the nature of the starch, and other components in the food? This should mean that all carbohydrate foods should show a slightly different blood glucose response when you feed the same amount of them in a meal. And so we tested that, and to our surprise, we were right. We didn't think we were going to be right. We thought that they'd all be much of a muchness, but they weren't. And so we saw, for example, that peas, beans, and lentils, which are very traditional foods, have very flat blood glucose responses when you have 50 grams of carbohydrate from those foods. And we found that pasta, for example, and bread, which are, on the face of it, can be made from hard semolina wheat and should therefore be the same, are quite different when you actually feed them, and that pasta may have half the blood glucose rise for the same amount of carbohydrate as bread has. And so that's, I think, where the story started developing, and we realized that one had to then index these to something. And we indexed them, first of all, to glucose, and then later we indexed them to bread, because we found bread was fairly standard. And so we could say that if you had a glycemic index on the bread scale of 50, it would be just, you'd have a blood glucose rise half as much as you would have for bread when you took the same amount of carbohydrate in a meal. And that was, if you like, the birth of the glycemic index.
So it's about the fiber being intact, really, is what I'm hearing. And
well, what you're hearing is fiber was the inspiration.
Right.
But if you have an amylose starch as opposed to a myelopectin starch, the myelopectin starch, it's the same starch. It's CH2O is the chemical formula for it. They're all CH2O, but some CH2Os dissolve more slowly than others. So if you take bread and you put it in water, you find that it breaks up, it fragments into small pieces, and you can't pull it out again. You try pulling a piece of bread that you've crumbled up and put into water. You try pulling it out of the water again. You can't. You put it in your glass, and your mother will want to know why you've been doing it. Do you know what I mean? Because you've obviously been playing with your food. On the other hand, if you take your pasta from your plate and drop it into a glass of water, before your mother comes, you can whip it out very quickly, and there's not a trace, apart from the tomato sauce. Do you know what I mean? There's no trace that you've been doing anything wrong with your food. And that's because the water will penetrate the bread very rapidly, but not the pasta. And the water takes with it the digestive enzymes of your pancreas. And so that's why the digestive enzymes have less chance to attack pasta quickly than they do bread, which they can attack quite quickly because the water is taken up more universally into the bread.
And so we hear about this glycemic index term, and we hear about it a lot when we talk about people with diabetes. So how do people use this glycemic index to help themselves with their nutrition?
Well, what we've been doing in terms of our patients with diabetes is advising them to take low glycemic index diets. It's not the answer to diabetes, but we believe it's helpful. And we've shown that it produces small but significant reductions in hemoglobin A1C, which is the clinical marker of diabetes control and carbohydrate metabolism in the diabetic patient.
We're taking a short break to let you know that this episode of the Plant Trainers podcast is brought to you by Energy Bits.
If you want a healthy, natural way to fuel your workouts or fire up your brain, Energy Bits are for you. Energy Bits are tiny spirulina algae tabs that are nutritionally dense, a source of mental and physical energy that is all natural and causes no stomach distress. They eliminate fatigue and hunger instantly with no caffeine, sugar, chemicals, gluten, or soy, just pure plant-based nutrition. 1 ingredient, 1 calorie, and 0 net carbs. I use them before workouts or sometimes just as a snack. They make me feel great and give me that extra energy boost I'm sometimes looking for. I also use Recovery Bits, which are tiny chlorella tabs. I use them after workouts or when I'm feeling hungry late at night. Visit energybits.com and order Energy Bits, Recovery Bits, Vitality Bits, or Skinny Bits, and use the promo code PLANTTRAINERS to get 20% off your order at checkout. The link will also be in the show notes just in case you didn't get that all down. Improve your energy, wellness, and waistline all at the same time with Energy Bits. Check out Energy Bits today and feel the difference. Your brain and body will say thank you.
And now back to the show. How do you feel about people using the glycemic index out of context? So you have people who are saying, if I eat foods that are high on the glycemic index, like watermelon or grapefruit, then that's not good for me. I could become diabetic. It's not something that we should be eating. We should all be just sticking to blueberries and raspberries and maybe some apples if we're actually eating fruit. How does that sit with you? Because I don't think that you meant to tell people that they shouldn't be eating fruit, but it's been taken out of context in this high protein, low carb, ketogenic kind of society now.
Well, I think that's right. What we did, and I think it's worth remembering, one of the reasons why we pushed the glycemic index concept as hard as we did is because carbohydrates were getting into trouble. People were beginning to run away from carbohydrates like it was a poison. And what we wanted to say is, don't run away from your peas, beans, lentils. These are good foods. And we had to find, I think, reasons why they were good foods. And one of the reasons was that they had a low glycemic index. And so that then became, we wanted that to be a selling point for carbohydrate foods, especially for useful ones. Now, we're certainly not saying that you shouldn't have pineapple and you shouldn't have foods that you enjoy, mangoes, etc. Well, yes, because believe me, even these are relatively low glycemic index on the bread scale, but they're not as low as blueberries, raspberries, or lentils. So that's true. So if you want to sort of turn up the heat on getting your hemoglobin A1C down, eating more of those sorts of foods might be a good idea. That's what we're saying. But we're not saying run away from plant-based foods. We're quite the reverse. We're saying, no, eat plant-based foods, but here are some foods that even if you're a diabetic will do well for you. And if you're not a diabetic, you won't have a problem. And if they get rid of the saturated fat and cholesterol in your diet, this is good.
I love that you're saying that, and I hope that everybody listening now shares that message out, because I think it's a misconception, and hearing it from your mouth is definitely a powerful thing.
Well, I have to say that we're always criticized because people say, well, carrots have got the same glycemic index as a Mars bar, and so which should people eat? And I'm saying that those are not the criteria. that you should judge your diet on. Your diet should be, I think, judged on, are you eating healthy, balanced, plant-based foods? Which sort of foods fit in? Can you have avocado, which has got fat in it? Of course you can. What other sorts of foods can one have? Should one have olive oil? Well, that seems to have even a very beneficial effect on many measures that we've got. So yes, you can have oils, but they're plant-based oils. So I think what we're talking about is the various virtues of plant-based foods, and the carrot is excellent. Its glycemic index may be relatively high when you cook it, but quite honestly, to make any big difference to your blood glucose, you've got to have a couple of kilograms of carrots, and that would be great if you did, because you certainly wouldn't be eating too much of anything else.
Too many Mars bars.
Absolutely. So I think this is all a little bit tongue-in-cheek by people who are, as it were, poking holes where you can poke holes. But I can poke holes in anything. I would far rather when people try to be constructive in the way they try and put things together. And I think one can be destructive or constructive. And I think that it's a good thing to talk pleasantly about plant foods because they are useful. I think if one can have foods that are less processed, that may be very helpful too. But I have to say that there are processed foods that are pretty good for people too when you compare them with the alternative. And I'm going to pass off a little bit on out of the glycemic index thing and talk about the plant protein foods that are being put together now as burgers and dogs and fake meats. These are highly processed. But if they're processed in the right way with the right ingredients, I think they can make a positive difference. So when people say, are you against processed foods? I will say no, but it's the type of foods and the type of processing that's important.
You mentioned the oils, and we've had conversations with Dr. Esselstyn and Dr. Barnard, and they talk about low-fat diet approaches, and they're working to battle obesity and chronic illnesses and coronary artery disease, heart disease, lowering cholesterol. And you did some research that suggested that nuts were good in lowering cholesterol. What are your thoughts on the impact of consuming nuts and oils as far as long-term health goes, plaque formation, mortality, those kind of things?
Well, obviously, I've got a tremendous respect for what Neil Barnard has been doing. He's made tremendous advances in diabetes treatment with vegan diets. In fact, he's brought me as a collaborator. I've been honored to be put as a collaborator on these studies with him. So I'm absolutely with him, and I understand that you can achieve a tremendous amount with a low-fat, plant-based diet. So don't misunderstand me on that. But what I am saying is that many people seem to require fat organoleptically. They like the taste. I would far rather that they had an avocado than they had a beef steak that was dripping with fat.
Right.
And then what about the difference between avocado and oil or plant-based oil?
Well, you can actually buy avocado oil now
Yes,
at quite a rate in stores. So I don't think it matters. The oil in foods, in the olive, may or may not, and I don't know. I really have no evidence. May be more advantage than the oil in olive oil. But I have to say that when people have been placed on diets that are high in olive oil or nuts, they seem to have done better in terms of stroke and atrial fibrillation. So I think these studies have been shown. The Predimed study from Spain showed quite nicely the benefits of olive oil and nuts in cardiovascular disease. That's Predimed 1. They're now doing Predimed 2. So hopefully we will see some good data coming out from that in the next few years. But again, these studies are extremely expensive. You need to put 6,000 people into a study and follow them for 4 to 6 years. So, I mean, I think the chances of getting a lot of our nutrients looked at in detail, unfortunately is small, because the amount of money put into nutrition research as opposed to the amount of money that one can raise for drug research is relatively trivial. So although we would like everything to be done with the same precision as one expects from drugs in nutrition, we don't seem to have that luxury. Right. So we have to make a number of assumptions, and I think we do. And a lot of these assumptions are made by healthy populations, and I think healthy populations seem to be those who have been taking the fruit of the olive tree and making the most use of it. And that we call part of the Mediterranean diet. Now, the Mediterranean diet may not be eaten much nowadays because the Mediterraneans have moved on to the Western diet, unfortunately. And in the West, we're now trying to grapple with how we can get to a Mediterranean diet. So we're all in a bit of a difficult spot nutritionally. But I think we all agree on the general direction. I think the general direction is plant foods. There are those who've perfected the low-fat plant food, and it's done very well in the situations that they've used it. There are those who put in some plant-based oils and see some advantages there. Remember, these are plant-based oils that will be displacing your animal fats and animal proteins. So I think that, again, with nutrition, you can't add something and see the effect of simply the addition, or take something away and simply see the effects of taking it away. Because in one case, you're going to increase body weight. Otherwise, you have to do something else with the diet. In the other case, you're going to take something away, and they're going to lose weight unless you add something. So with diet, you're left. You can't move things around and just have a clean study as you can with a medication, which you don't require for your metabolism. I can give you a drug or not, and that's fine. That doesn't. I can't give you food or not. Do you know what I mean? I've got to do something. I've got to give you one sort of food or another sort of food. So you're always looking for the comparison.
So we want to be mindful of your time, and we're so grateful that you're here with us today. We have 2 more quick questions for you, if you'll indulge us. Number 1 is, we wanted to know, what is your favorite plant-based meal?
Wow, that's a difficult one, because I have so many favorites. I enjoy lentil soup.
I enjoy lentil soup too.
I am a fan of tofu. So a lot of people will turn up their nose at that, you see. But if you've had it done the right way, I think you can be a fan of tofu.
So you're not scared off by all that research about tofu being bad for you and the estrogen levels and all that?
Well, I think that there's been Mark Messina has written widely on this, and I think it's worth quoting. But I think that in terms of the breast cancer scare, and I don't want to take up more of your time, we had a lot of concerns about putting our patients who were middle-aged women on soy because of Mark Helfrich's work from Chicago on athymic nude mice and the effects of genistein and the effects of soy with isoflavones on breast cancer development in this animal model, so-called. And so we decided we should not advocate that women who may have certainly had breast cancer should be placed on diets that contain soy. And I have to say that many, many years ago, this was, one lady who had been doing very well in terms of a cholesterol reduction, who had been taking soy as part of the dietary portfolio, said, well, I'm not going to do that because I think my risk of heart disease is probably worse than the breast cancer risk that I've got, because I've had breast cancer. We found out that she'd had a recurrence, and we thought that this was perhaps related to soy. Well, she had some tamoxifen. She maintained her soy. She wouldn't give it up. The breast cancer, 15 years later, doesn't seem to have gone anywhere. And her gynecologist told her just to continue. And she came back to me and saw me just a little while ago and said, well, there you are. And I felt a little bit humbled at that point because we told her to do something in good faith that probably wasn't going to suit her, and that the literature is now showing that women, even those on adjuvant therapy who maintain soy intake or have soy intake, do better than those who don't take soy. So, I mean, these are obviously cohort studies. They're not randomized controlled trials.
Right.
So there may be other confounding factors. But the data have come out, I think, fairly strongly that soy does not seem to be responsible for increased mortality of breast cancer amongst women. And I think the Shanghai women's breast cancer study was one of those that showed it, and had women who were taking soy in large amounts and in small amounts. So there was a greater range there. Now, people will say, well, these are Oriental people and they're different from us. Do you know what I mean? But I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether when we have data that's fairly robust, that one can make those sort of judgments quickly. It may be true that if we have soy early in life, it's good for you later in life. But I think all these are sort of extra refinements to the argument. I'm not sure, though, that we can say that there's anything that's definitively wrong. Now, there may be some binding of thyroid hormones in those who've got thyroid insufficiency, and that may prove to be something in the way of a problem. But I think that one needs to be very sure then that there's iodine adequacy in people who go on to significant amounts of soy as part of their dietary lifestyle. But I think adequate iodine intakes are good for all people. Do you know what I mean? Not just for people who are going to be taking soy. So I think that I see soy as having a relatively good profile, and I think I get more consolation, as it were, for prescribing soy when I think back to the fact that soy, even tofu as the soy, was invented, as I understand it, in Japan about 200 BC, and it's fed the Orient and allowed them to increase their population size considerably over the last 2,000 years. And the effects have been pretty minimal by comparison with the concern that we've got over the Western diet, which contains no soy.
I think that the studies are huge there, and that's also another message for the listeners to repeat, play back again, and then share with those that they love, so that we're not living in a place of fear, but that we're living in a place of science, 100%. Our last question for you, if you could sum up maybe in 2 or 3 sentences, we know that you have a very strong outlook on where this world is headed if we don't make some drastic changes. So what is your message to the masses out there in terms of creating a much better world?
Well, I think a much better world could be created if people thought more about what they were doing. And I think if the education system that we've got changed so that what we call basic is truly basic, not simply basic science that Isaac Newton was very good at. I think we have to teach children more about their environment, more about where their food comes from, more about the way that they should be consuming that food, and the way that we should be treating the environment. Because I think if we don't learn to treat the environment and other species with a great deal of respect, then I think that as this planet becomes more crowded, we will treat each other with much less respect.
Agreed. That's beautifully put. And we thank you so much, Dr. Jenkins, for all the work that you have been doing here. We thank you so much for taking the time with us here today. And we really do enjoy your messages, and we are looking forward to getting them out to all of our listeners and for them to share that as well.
Well, thank you. And I hope you've got enough so that you can be quite liberal with what you leave on the cutting floor.
We definitely have.
We got a lot. Thank you so much, Dr. Jenkins, for all the research you're doing and everything you're doing to help this planet. We really do appreciate it.
Well, thank you for getting the message out.
Perfect. And just so that you know, I'll also be writing an article for Veg World magazine, and I'll be including a lot of the things that we talked about in this conversation as well.
Well, I hope it's good for you, and we'll look forward to that.
Perfect. We'll be in touch. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you so much for listening to this edition of the Plant Trainers Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or any other podcast listening platforms. We appreciate the feedback we receive from you. Every time we get a 5-star rating or review on iTunes from one of our fans, it ensures other people will find us too. Thanks to our patrons. To become a patron, visit www.patreon.com/planttrainers. Even supporting us with $1 really makes a difference. Connect and follow us on Instagram and Twitter @PlantTrainers. Like Plant Trainers on Facebook, join our newsletter, and check out our website at www.planttrainers.com for awesome plant-based recipes and a list of our services. Email your questions to info@planttrainers.com so we can answer them on our upcoming Facebook Lives. We hope we've inspired you today. Join us again next time and have a healthy day.